that we pause to look across the pond and reflect on what it is that the president has been saying tonight. I mean, these press conferences are just getting more and more, well, bizarre. And they're certainly mesmerising. You can't take your eyes off it, because the president last night had a full-on frontal attack on the press again. And tonight he's going after the World Health Organization. And frankly, I can sort of understand why to an extent. Let's speak to Simon Marks, LBC's US correspondent, who is live for us in Washington, D.C. Simon, what happened tonight?
Well, Tom, I will just make the point that it is actually becoming harder for Americans to see these, and I think they're more accurately described as briefings by President Trump than press conferences. I mean, tonight he went on into a second hour. For the first hour, he didn't take a single question. He simply stood there and talked about all the fabulous things that his administration is doing to confront coronavirus. And many of the television networks here are now cutting away from these press briefings on a routine basis rather than simply hand their airtime over to a man who is increasingly using these appearances as part of his re-election campaign. The big news tonight came relatively early in the course of events, and it was the announcement about the World Health Organization.
Today I'm instructing my administration to halt funding of the World Health Organization while a review is conducted to assess the World Health Organization's role in severely mismanaging and covering up the spread of the coronavirus. Everybody knows what's going on there. American taxpayers provide between $400 million and $500 million per year to the WHO. In contrast, China contributes roughly $40 million a year, and even less. As the organization's leading sponsor, the United States has a duty to insist on full accountability. One of the most dangerous and costly decisions from the WHO was its disastrous decision to oppose travel restrictions from China and other nations. They were very much opposed to what we did. Fortunately, I was not convinced and suspended travel from China, saving untold numbers of lives. Thousands and thousands of people would have died.
Now, just to be clear, President Trump did not actually suspend all travel from China, as he keeps claiming. He continued to allow American citizens and green card holders to return to the United States from China with every possibility that they were bringing coronavirus back into the United States with them. And on that claim that the World Health Organization engaged in mismanagement and a cover-up, he hasn't specified what he means by that. He suggested during the course of this news conference that he faulted the World Health Organization for believing that China was being transparent about coronavirus back in January. But if you look at Donald Trump's own Twitter feed, January the 24th, he tweeted, "China has been working very hard to contain the coronavirus. The United States greatly appreciates their efforts and transparency. It will all work out well." So at the time, President Trump himself was very much engaged in actions that he now accuses the World Health Organization of having been engaged in. He said in the past that for months the World Health Organization covered up the existence of coronavirus and didn't pass details of it onto the United States. The White House has offered absolutely no evidence to substantiate that claim whatsoever. The other news tonight came in the president's description of what he says will be the national reopening that he intends to be the architect of over the course of potentially the next few days.
The plans to reopen the country are close to being finalized. I will be speaking to all 50 governors very shortly, and I will then be authorizing each individual governor of each individual state to implement a reopening and a very powerful reopening plan of their state at a time and in a manner as most appropriate.
Now, just to be clear again, he doesn't have the power to authorize governors of individual states to reopen their states, even a very powerful reopening. That's simply not the way the Constitution works. He can tell them what he'd like to see, but they can turn around and tell him that they're not going to listen to what he has to say, despite his claim last night that he has total authority to oversee the national reopening. He suggested, Tom, that in as many as 20 states, so almost half the country, he believes it ought to be possible to reopen the economy as soon as May the 1st, and possibly earlier than that. He, of course, has his eye on November because that is when he hopes his re-election will be coming, and he hopes that he's building the case for that re-election by encouraging everyone to begin the process of going back to work and going back to their businesses, even though public health officials and many of America's governors are deeply fearful about the prospects of a second wave of infection that would be caused by any kind of reopening that isn't very, very carefully calibrated over the next several weeks and months.
I was reading something, Simon, in the immediate aftermath of the president's announcement about suspending and cutting funding to the World Health Organization, that he can't actually do it because that money is appropriated by Congress.
Well, he's certainly going to need congressional support, and already the Democrats have put out a press release insisting that under no circumstances do they believe that the time is right to cut funding from the World Health Organization. Look, there are all sorts of arguments that say the World Health Organization did not act in the most efficient manner possible, that they were too taken in by China in the immediate weeks after the disclosure that this virus existed in Wuhan. But President Trump isn't making those arguments in a detailed manner. In fact, he's making allegations and assertions that he can't back up, that they were engaged in a cover-up for months. There is no evidence of that whatsoever. And the fear among even those people who are critical of the World Health Organization is that if you defund them now, you absolutely thrust them into the hands of China, and you will end up increasing China's influence over the World Health Organization, which is precisely what you profess to want to avoid. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see once this review period is over, whether he really goes ahead and pulls the money, or whether he's simply trying to create a bit of a straw man, a target for the blame game right now because it's politically expedient for him to do that. Let's see if at the end of the day they really pull the money.
And it's interesting, Simon, it plays into the conversation that we're having at the moment, but you say that some of the cable network TV channels are starting to pull away from this thing, perhaps realising that they are being co-opted into broadcasting a Donald Trump rally, which contains limited news and has there's no sort of transparency around it. He's just reeling off details. I saw he said something about wanting not to have to watch 14-year-old reruns of baseball games because he wants to get sports running back up again. So there's all that going on. I wonder in the furnace that is American politics as it heads towards an election, what the public mood is around the president and his handling of this versus how the press are dealing with this and responding to this.
No, it's a very reasonable point. And we know from all the polling that his approval ratings are absolutely holding up and have risen since coronavirus became the crisis that it's become. I mean, today was the day that we passed another threshold, 25,000 deaths in the United States. He didn't dwell on that at all during the course of this briefing tonight. He has not dwelled on that during previous briefings. And yet his approval ratings continue to retain a tremendous amount of solidity. Republicans tell pollsters that they are enthused about the prospect of voting for him in far greater numbers than Democrats tell pollsters they are enthused about voting for Joe Biden. Joe Biden, who, of course, today won Barack Obama's endorsement for this November's presidential election. I think, from his demeanor during these briefings, things, whether they're carried on the broadcast networks or not, he is a man who remains supremely confident and absolutely determined that blame for this crisis, he's simply going to sort of slough off. He's not going to allow he's going to be the Teflon candidate in this election. That's how he's positioning himself. He's going to attach blame to the Chinese, to the World Health Organization, and to the governors of Democrat-run states between now and November, and he's going to hope that that proves to be a winning strategy.
Simon, great to talk to you as always. Thank you again. LBC's US correspondent in Washington, D.C.